So, what is the ideology? What is it that they're teaching?
I mean, the ideology ultimately is Marxism applied through the lenses of identity. And that's because in the 60s, they realized that economics wasn't going to work. They had to go through cultural aspects where there were points of grievance that they could dredge up. Capitalism was working too well. It was, in the words of these critical Marxists, it was stabilizing the working class. It made them stable. It made them content. Maybe they didn't have like the best life. Maybe they're not driving two Ferraris and a Bugatti or whatever's in the news this week, but they do have, their nice Camaro and they're proud of it. And they wash it on Saturday and they roll around the neighborhood and they have their, they don't eat gourmet, but they have some nice stuff. They're happy with their, 3 bedroom or 2 bedroom home and their little family and their picket fence and whatever else. And it's actually made people happy. And they say it. They say, I mean, in their own words, these Marxists in the 60s are saying capitalism has delivered the goods. It enables people to build a better life. It stabilizes the working class and turns them conservative. So then they say, well, what we have to do is look for the same ideas, these same radicalizations have to take place in different domains. And then they say specifically identity politics. They say racial minorities, sexual minorities, feminists, outsiders. And they really, really pushed into capitalizing upon civil rights movements like liberal feminism in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And inside you have this angry, radical feminist core. The gay civil rights movement has inside of it this angry, radical, what's called queer agenda that's now manifested, and of course it's displaced women and every other thing inside the much more complicatedly inside the thing we usually refer to as the civil rights movement, which was a racial civil rights movement. You have these very heavy duty radicals, uh, black liberationists, black nationalists, and so on, who had a much different vision for America. And that you can see is the same ideology because, for example, there's this thing in education right now called social emotional learning. It seems to manifest in some new form every 2 or 3 years. And the newest one that's coming down the pike is called culturally affirming social emotional learning. And their document that they sent to Biden's Department of Education explicitly says that their list of social emotional learning demands is based off of the demands of the Black Panther Party. I mean, they openly say it. So the radicalism shifted out of economic class because America was too successful and into identity politics. And that's really just blossomed ever since. But the ideology is the same. Some people are uh, doing well in society. They're therefore bought into a system of oppression that they uphold. Other people are being exploited and alienated from their society and oppressed by that. And it's their job to come together in solidarity and overthrow the system and take control of it, take control of the means of production of society, whether culturally or materially, so that we can have a more socially just and equitable future. It's the same communism, new package.
So, some people might say that there has been racism historically in America, in enshrined in the actual system, right? With
Right.
Jim Crow and slavery and um, redlining, things like that. So how come CRT is not a good response to that, and what would be a good response to that?
Well, I mean,
Shouldn't we acknowledge that Black people have systemically been oppressed, and that there are going to be byproducts of that that are going to make them not be at the same starting point? So, what is wrong with CRT's solution, and what is a good solution?
sure. I mean, so those are realities, and we must acknowledge the truth. And those facts are facts, and that there are terrible legacies of those historical circumstances are also facts, and we have to acknowledge those. Well, the way that CRT diagnoses this, though, is to say that the system itself is the problem, whereas if we actually look at the history of humanity in a broader context, what we realize is that the system itself was the solution to a pervasive problem, which is that human beings have been enslaving and exploiting each other, often for racial reasons or clan based reasons or whatever other reasons. And finally, we come up with this system that even the founders, if you read in their own words, they struggled. The founders of the US struggled with the idea of slavery. Thomas Jefferson held slaves. Everybody knows this. We shouldn't shy away from the fact. And he wrote all these letters. He also wrote the Declaration of Independence, where he said all men are created equal. Then he also wrote all these letters to people struggling with the fact that he couldn't solve the most thorny moral problem of his era, and that his guilt at having to kick it down to a later generation, knowing and saying that it might be in fact the thing that would destroy the nation when the time of reckoning on that issue came up, and it nearly did. It turns out that the system that was laid down is not necessarily in any way perfect, but the idea of individual rights, the idea of those being secured through a Bill of Rights and through divided powers, et cetera, is actually the system is the solution to the problem that has plagued humanity all along. And around that same time in history, we start to see this kind of massive movement, not just in the United States but other countries, taking up these ideals of individualism and individual rights and individual liberties, being the things that break down those evils. Critical race theory wants people to believe that only by empowering critical race theorists, which means it's a gigantic grift machine, can we possibly come up with a new system, a totally new system that would create a future of racial justice by enforcing what they call equity. Well, what did the Department of Education from the state of Virginia just put out in the last couple of days? They've lied about this to us, by the way, for several years. They said, no, no, no. Equity means equal access. It means equality of access, right? They just put out, in their own words, word for word, equity means, they said, equity of access and equal outcomes for all students, no exceptions. It means enforced equal outcomes. It means the redistribution of shares to make citizens equal. That's also the definition of socialism. And so we know that socialism doesn't work. We know that racial socialism isn't going to work. We know that where we've empowered the people who claim to be these kind of race gurus, all we've seen is division, all we've seen is pain, all we've seen is failure, all we've seen is people's is racial tensions going up, not coming down, racial resentment going up, not coming down. The right solution is to do what we were trying to do before critical race theory kind of emerged as this big force, maybe in the 80s and 90s, going forward into the 2000s. And what we were doing then was that we were holding up examples of success. We were holding up, role models and saying, look, we understand there's been this terrible history, but you grow up right, you get raised right, you come out right, and you can become a success story here in America just like anybody else. And we were really, I'm not trying to say we need to go back to the 90s or anything like that, but we were really taking some correct steps before we started to get into this deep politics of resentment, to believe that the system is the problem and that the only way we can fix the problem is to put apparently a bunch of grifters in power. That doesn't work. What we have to do is continue to appeal to people's broader humanity. What we have to do is continue to use the system to make sure that we're not discriminating, etc. And I think that critical race theory not only misdiagnoses the nature of the problem, but if it got it right, it misprescribes the solution exactly. It gets it exactly backwards. More race consciousness rather than less, that's not going to fix the problem.